Joseph's epic roller coaster, from son to prisoner to Egypt's big boss. All right, little ones, gather round because today we're going on a wild ride through the life of Joseph. Now, Joseph's story is one of sibling rivalry, crazy dreams, dramatic twists, and the most awkward family reunion you can imagine. Buckle up, because Joseph's life was like a roller coaster, full of ups, downs, and a few spins along the way. So let's start with the basics. Joseph was one of 12 brothers. 12! Can you imagine how loud that household must have been? And out of all those brothers, Joseph was, let's say, the favorite. Oh yes, Joseph was his father Jacob's absolute favorite. Jacob didn't even try to hide it. He gave Joseph a super fancy, colorful coat, the kind of coat that practically screamed, "Look at me, I'm special." It was like a royal robe in a family of plain old tunics. Now picture Joseph walking around in his new coat, strutting a little, twirling here and there to make sure everyone got a good look. His brothers were not amused. They were out there doing hard work, probably sweating under the sun. And here comes Joseph in his flashy coat, looking like he just stepped out of a fashion show. They probably thought, "Oh, great, here comes Mr. Fancy Robe." But Joseph wasn't just a fashionista. He was also a dreamer. And boy, did he love talking about his dreams. One day he told his brothers, "Hey, guess what? I had a dream where all of you were bowing down to me." Now, can you imagine their faces? They probably looked at each other like, did he just say bow down to him? But Joseph, completely unfazed, went on about how they were like bundles of wheat bowing to his bundle. The brothers were probably rolling their eyes so hard they could see the back of their heads. And just when you thought Joseph would get the hint and maybe, stop bragging, he had another dream. This time he told them, "I dreamed the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." His brothers' jaws must have hit the floor. They were thinking, "Oh, now he thinks even the sun and moon are going to bow down to him. This kid is out of control." Even their dad Jacob was like, "Hold on, Joseph. Are you saying your mother and I will bow to you too?" The brothers were done. Absolutely done. They were so fed up with Mr. Dreams-a-Lot that they came up with a plan to get rid of him. One day, while they were out in the fields, they saw Joseph coming from a distance. Probably because that coat was so bright it was like a walking rainbow in the desert. One brother nudged the other and said, "Here comes the dreamer. Let's teach him a lesson." They grabbed Joseph, yanked off his fancy coat, and threw him into an empty well. Poor Joseph must have been so confused, sitting at the bottom of the well thinking, guys, this isn't funny." But it wasn't over yet. Just as the brothers were deciding what to do next, they spotted a caravan of traders heading to Egypt. They looked at each other, grinned, and thought, "Why don't we sell him?" And that's exactly what they did. They sold Joseph to the traders for 20 pieces of silver and waved him goodbye. And just like that, Joseph went from being the favorite son with a fancy coat to a slave on his way to Egypt. Talk about a plot twist. When Joseph arrived in Egypt, he was sold to a man named Potiphar, who was an officer in Pharaoh's army. Now, even though Joseph was in a tough situation, God was with him, and everything he did turned out well. Potiphar noticed this and put Joseph in charge of his entire household. Things were finally looking up for Joseph, until another twist happened. Potiphar's wife noticed that Joseph was handsome, and she tried to get him into trouble. When Joseph refused her, she got angry and told a big lie about him, saying he did something he didn't do. Poor Joseph. He was thrown into prison for something he didn't even do. Can you imagine? Going from being in charge of a big household to sitting in a dark, gloomy prison cell? But even in prison, God was with Joseph. The prison guard noticed that Joseph was trustworthy and put him in charge of all the other prisoners. And while he was there, Joseph met two of Pharaoh's servants, the cupbearer and the baker, who were also in prison. One night, they each had strange dreams and were worried because they didn't know what they meant. Joseph, always helpful, said, "Tell me your dreams. God can help me interpret them." The cupbearer went first. He told Joseph about his dream, and Joseph explained, "Good news! In 3 days you'll be restored to your position." The baker, hearing the good news, was excited to share his dream too. But Joseph's face grew serious and he said, Not so good news. In 3 days you'll lose your life." And that's exactly what happened. The cupbearer was restored to his position, and the baker, well, let's just say his dream came true too. Before the cupbearer left, Joseph said, "Remember me when you get back to Pharaoh." But guess what? The cupbearer forgot about him. So poor Joseph stayed in prison, waiting and waiting, until one day Pharaoh himself had a strange dream. In his dream, 7 fat cows were eaten by 7 skinny cows, and then 7 full ears of grain were eaten by 7 thin, shriveled ears. Pharaoh was baffled and called for all the wise men and magicians, but no one could interpret his dream. Finally, the cupbearer remembered Joseph. He told Pharaoh, "There's a guy in prison who can interpret dreams." Pharaoh quickly sent for Joseph, and Joseph, probably a bit dusty from the prison, came before Pharaoh. He listened to Pharaoh's dream and then said, "God is telling you that there will be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. You should save food during the good years to prepare for the bad ones." Pharaoh was so impressed that he made Joseph his second in command. From the pit to the palace, Joseph was now the most powerful man in Egypt, right under Pharaoh. Imagine Joseph walking around in royal robes, giving orders and probably thinking, "Wow, this is a long way from that well." During the years of famine, people from all over came to Egypt to buy food, and one day Joseph's brothers showed up. They didn't recognize him, but Joseph knew exactly who they were. Oh, the irony. They had come unknowingly to bow before their brother, just like in his dreams. Joseph decided to test them. He hid his identity and put them through a series of challenges before finally revealing himself. His brothers were shocked and terrified, thinking he'd take revenge. But Joseph, with a forgiving heart, embraced them and said, "What you meant for evil, God meant for good." So, after all the drama, all the twists and all the dreams, here's how Joseph's story wraps up, my little ones. Get ready, because this ending is the biggest, most epic family reunion ever. After revealing himself to his brothers, Joseph didn't stop at just forgiving them. He wanted to make sure his entire family was safe during the famine. So he told his brothers, "Go back home, get Dad, and bring the whole family here to Egypt. Pharaoh is going to give us the best land in Egypt, the land of Goshen. It'll be like our own little neighborhood, just for us." Now can you imagine the brothers' journey back to Canaan? They were probably whispering to each other, "How are we going to explain all this to Dad? Hey, Dad, remember Joseph? The one we told you was eaten by a wild animal? Surprise! He's alive and the second most powerful man in Egypt." They must have been sweating buckets, trying to figure out how to break the news. But when they finally reached home, they spilled the beans, and Jacob couldn't believe it. His favorite son, his Joseph, was alive. Jacob, old as he was, probably jumped up like a young man and said, "Pack everything, we're going to Egypt." So Jacob, his sons, their wives, the grandkids, the sheep, the goats, everyone packed up and headed to Egypt. It was like a massive family road trip, only instead of cars, they had donkeys and camels. And let me tell you, this was no small move. It was like packing up an entire village and relocating it. When they arrived in Egypt, Joseph was waiting. Can you imagine that moment? Jacob sees Joseph from a distance, and his heart leaps. Joseph runs to his father, and they hug each other tightly, probably crying tears of joy. Jacob must have thought he was dreaming, seeing his son alive and well, and looking all fancy in his Egyptian robes. Pharaoh kept his promise, giving them the land of Goshen, a beautiful green land perfect for raising all their sheep and goats. Jacob and his family settled in, and it was like one giant family sleepover. They cooked, they laughed, they told stories, and they enjoyed being together after all those years apart. And that's how Joseph's story ends, with forgiveness, family, and faith. From the bottom of a well to the heights of Pharaoh's palace, Joseph's life was a reminder that even in the hardest times, God has a plan. And that plan brought the whole family together, safe and sound, in the land of Egypt. Connecting to Jesus. Now, my dear ones, you might be wondering, what does Joseph's story have to do with Jesus? Well, just as Joseph forgave his brothers and welcomed them with open arms, Jesus forgives us and invites us to be part of his family. Joseph's story teaches us that even when people make mistakes or hurt us, we can choose forgiveness, just like Jesus forgives us. And just as God had a plan for Joseph, even when things looked bad, God has a plan for us too. Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of God's plan. He came to bring us back to God, to give us hope, and to show us that even in difficult times, God is working things out for our good. Genesis 50:20. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Remember, little ones, that God's plans are always greater than what we can see. Joseph's life went through many ups and downs, but God used each part of his story for something amazing. In the same way, Jesus is with us through all our ups and downs, guiding us and turning even hard times into something good. We can trust that Jesus, like Joseph, is working to save and bless us. Dear God, thank you for the story of Joseph and for teaching us about forgiveness, family, and faith. Thank you for sending Jesus, who forgives us and loves us, just as Joseph forgave his brothers. Help us to trust in your plan for our lives, even when things are hard, and help us to be people who forgive others with open hearts. May we always remember that you are with us, guiding us, just like you were with Joseph. Amen.